Okay, here's chapter 15. While the two girls crouched in the bushes with their hands over their faces, they heard the voice of the witch calling out, "Now follow me, and all will be set with what remains of this war. It will not take us long to crush the human vermin and the traitors, now that the great fool, the great cat, lies dead." And at this moment the children were for a few seconds in very great danger. For with the wild cries and noise of the skirling pipes and shrill horns blowing, the whole of that vile rabble came sweeping off the hilltop, down the slope, past their hiding places. They felt the specters go by like a cold wind, and they felt the ground shaking beneath them under the galloping feet of the minotaurs, and overhead flurry of the foul wings and the blackness of the vultures and great bats. At any other time they would have trembled with fear, but now the sadness and shame and the horror of Aslan's death filled their minds. They hardly even thought of it. As soon as the wood was silent again, Susan and Lucy crept out onto the open hilltop. The moon was getting low, and thin clouds were passing across her, but still they could see the shape of the lion lying dead in his bonds. And down they both knelt in the wet grass and kissed his cold face and stroked his beautiful fur, what was left of it, and cried until they could cry no more. And then they looked at each other and held each other's hands for mere loneliness and cried again. And then they were silent, and Lucy at last said, "I can't bear to look at the horrible muzzle. Can we take it off of him?" So they tried, and after a lot of working at it, for their fingers were cold, and it was now the darkest part of the night, they succeeded. And then they saw his face. Without it, they burst again into tears, crying, and kissed his face, and fondled it, and wiped away the blood and the foam as well as they could. And it was all the more lonely and hopeless and horrid than I know how to describe. "I wonder, could we untie him?" said Susan. But the enemies, out of pure spitefulness, had drawn the cord so tight the girls could do nothing from the knots. I hope no one who reads this book has been miserable like Susan and Lucy were that night. But if you've been up all night and cried till you have no more tears left in you, you will know that there comes in the end a sort of quietness. You feel as if nothing was ever going to happen again. At any rate, that's how they felt. Hours and hours seemed to go by in the dead calm, and they hardly noticed that they were getting colder and colder. But at last Lucy noticed two other things. One was the sky on the east side of the hill was a little less dark than it had been an hour ago. The other was tiny movements going in the grass at her feet. At first she took no interest in this. What did this matter? Nothing mattered now. But at last she saw whatever it was had begun to move with the upright stones of the stone table. And now, whatever they were, moving about on Aslan's body, she peered close. They were little gray things. "Ugh," said Susan, "how beastly! Poor little mice crawling all over him. Go away!" She raised her hand to frighten them away. "Wait," said Lucy. "Can't you see what they're doing?" Both girls bent down and stared. "I do believe. How weird, they're nibbling away at the cords." "That's what I thought," said Lucy. "They're friendly mice, I think. Poor little things, they don't realize he's dead. I think it'll do some good untying him." It was quite definitely lighter by now. Each of the girls noticed for the first time the white faces of the other. They could see the mice nibbling away, dozens and dozens, even hundreds of little field mice, and at last, one by one, the ropes were all gnawed through. The sky in the east was whitish by now, and the stars were beginning to get fainter, all except one big star low down on the eastern horizon. They felt colder than they had been all night. The mice crept away again. The girls cleared away the remains of the gnawed ropes. Aslan looked more like himself without them. Every moment his dead face looked nobler. As the light grew, they could see it better. In the wood behind them, a bird gave a chuckling sound. It had been so still for hours that it startled them. Then another bird answered, and soon there were birds singing all over the place. It was quite definitely early morning now, not late at night. "I'm so cold," said Lucy. "So am I. Let's walk about a bit," said Susan. They walked to the eastern edge of the hill and looked down. The one big star had almost disappeared. The country looked dark gray, but beyond, at the very end of the world, the sea showed pale. The sky began to turn red. They walked to and fro more times than they could count between the dead Aslan and the eastern ridge, trying to keep warm, and how tired their legs felt. They at last stood for a moment looking out toward the sea and Cair Paravel, which they could only now just make out. The red turned to gold along the line where the sea and sky met, and then slowly up came the edge of the sun. And at that moment they heard from behind them a loud noise, a cracking, a deafening noise as if a giant had broken a giant plate. "What was that?" said Lucy. "I feel too afraid to turn around," she said. "Something awful is happening." "They're doing something worse to him. Come on," said Lucy, and she turned, pulling Susan around with her. The rising of the sun had made everything look so different. All colors and shadows were changed, that for a moment they didn't see the important thing. Then they did. The stone table was broken into two pieces by a great crack that ran down from end to end, and there was no Aslan. "Oh," said the girls. "Oh, that's too bad. They might have left the body alone." "Who's done that? What does this mean? Is this more magic?" said Susan. "Yes," said a voice behind their backs. "It is more magic." They looked around, and there, shining in the sunrise, larger than they had seen him before, shaking his mane, for it had apparently grown again, stood Aslan himself. "Oh, Aslan," said both the children. "Aren't you dead then, dear Aslan?" said Lucy. "Not now." "You're not a," asked Susan in a shaky voice. She couldn't bring herself to say the word ghost. Aslan stooped his golden head and licked her forehead. The warmth of his breath and a rich sort of smell that seemed to hang around his hair came all over her. "Do I look like it?" he said. "Oh, you're real, oh, Aslan," said Lucy, and both girls flung themselves upon him and covered him with kisses. "But what does this mean?" said Susan. "It means that though the witch knew deep magic, there is a magic deeper still that she does not know about. Her knowledge goes back only to the dawn of time. But if she could have looked back a little further into the stillness and darkness before time dawned, she would have read there was a different incantation. She would have known that when a willing victim who has committed no treachery is killed in a traitor's stead, the table will crack and death itself would start working backward. And now—" "Oh, yes, now? Oh, children, I feel my strength coming back to me," said the lion. "Catch me if you can," he said, and he stood for a second, his eyes bright, his limbs quivering, lashing himself with his tail, and then he made a leap high over their heads and landed on the other side of the table. Laughing, though she didn't know why, Lucy scrambled to reach him, and Aslan leaped again, and a mad chase began. Round and round the hilltop he led them, now hopelessly out of their reach, letting them almost catch his tail, diving between them, tossing them in the air with his huge and beautiful velvet paws, and catching them again and stopping unexpectedly so that the three of them rolled over together in a happy, laughing heap of fur and arms and legs. It was such a romp as no one had ever heard except in Narnia, and whether it was more like playing with a thunderstorm or playing with a kitten, Lucy could never make up her mind. And the funny thing was that when all three of them finally lay together, panting in the sun, the girls no longer felt the least bit tired or hungry or thirsty. "And now to business," he said. "I feel I'm going to roar. You better plug your ears." And they did, and Aslan stood up, and when he opened his mouth to roar, his face became so terrible they did not dare look at it. And they saw all the trees in front of him bend before the blast of the roaring as grass bends in a meadow breeze. And then he said, "We have a long journey to go. You must ride on my back." And he crouched down, and the children climbed to his warm golden back, and Susan sat first, holding tightly to his mane, and Lucy behind her, holding on tightly to Susan. And with a great heave, he rose underneath them and shot off faster than any horse into the forest. The ride was perhaps the most wonderful thing that happened to them in Narnia. Have you ever galloped on a horse? Think of that, but take away the heavy noise of the hooves and the jingle of the bits, and imagine instead the most noiseless padding of a great paw. Then imagine instead of the black or gray or chestnut back of the horse, the soft roughness of the golden fur and mane flying back in the wind. And imagine you are going twice as fast as a racehorse. And this is a mount that doesn't need to be guided and never grows tired. He rushed on, never missing his footing, never hesitating, threading his way with perfect skill through the tree trunks, jumping over bushes and briars and smaller streams, wading in the large, swimming in the largest of all. You're not riding on a road or in a park or even on the downs, but across Narnia, in spring, down solemn avenues of beech, and across sunny glades of oaks, through the wild orchards of snow-white cherry trees, past roaring waterfalls and mossy rocks and echoing caverns, up windy slopes alight with gorse bushes, and across the shoulders of healthy mountains, and along giddy ridges, and down, down again into the wild valleys, and out to the acres of blue flowers. It was nearly midday when they found themselves looking down a steep hillside at the castle. A little toy castle it looked from where they stood, which seemed to be all pointed towers. But when the lion was rushing down at such a speed, it grew larger every moment, and before they had time to ask themselves, they were already on level with it. And now it no longer looked like a toy castle, but rose frowning in front of all of them. No face looked over the battlements, and the gates were fast shut. And Aslan, not at all slacking his pace, rushed straight like a bullet toward it. "The witch's home," he said. "Hold tight, children." The next moment the whole world seemed to turn upside down, and the children felt as if they had left their insides behind them, for the lion had gathered himself together for a greater leap than any he had made, and jumped, or you may call it flying rather than jumping, right over the castle wall. The two girls, breathless but unhurt, found themselves tumbling off his back in the middle of a wide stone courtyard full of statues.